Hello everyone, welcome back to another video. My name is Zenitsu and today is going to be a little bit different. Today I'm actually going to be talking about staple cards that go into different worlds. Each world has its own set of staple cards that it likes to use, and then there are just generic cards that are good for almost every deck. Today I'm going to be talking more about those generic cards and why they are so powerful and what uses they can be used for. To start off the list, we have Loyalty. Loyalty is one of the best generic world cards because it literally can go into everything, and its ability is so powerful that it helps shut down basically decks entirely. The ability that really matters is for the turn, your opponent can't call more than 3 monsters. They're calling their third monster. In response, you just pop Loyalty, and basically they just have to go into attack unless they have other spells that they are going to be running. The other abilities of putting a soul of a monster on the field to the drop zone is also really good because attacking the soul, if they don't have any ways to protect their soul, just can be very valuable in certain matchups. And then on top of all of that, it also has a third ability. For this turn, the next damage dealt to you is reduced by 2. It just has a slew of different powerful effects, and it's very cost efficient at 1 gauge. Next, we have Buddy Block. Buddy Block is probably just one of the best generic defense spells in the game currently. Again, it's very cost efficient at being 1 gauge, and then it has 2 different abilities. The one you really care about is if your opponent is attacked 4 or more times during this turn, you just don't take damage from attacks. This just helps, again, shut down a lot of aggro decks that like to try to attack as many times as possible, calling as many different things as possible to try to get even more attacks. This just basically shuts it down completely, and you just won't be able to aggress past your 4th attack. And then it also has another defensive utility use of for this turn, the next damage you take is reduced by 3. Just having those options and the primary function of it to shut down attacks is just very strong in a lot of decks and against a lot of decks. Next, we have the ever so classic Recovery Veil. Recovery Veil is, for the most part, your anti-discard card for every deck. So if you're afraid your opponent's running discard, you have Recovery Veil to basically say, no, I got this, and the discard doesn't even hurt you after you Recovery Veil their discard trigger. And then on top of that, what it does is you can either put the top 2 cards of your deck into your gauge, or for this turn, the next damage you take by an attack is reduced to 0. So that's already really strong, on top of the fact that if this card's in your hand and it would be dropped by an opponent's card effect, you may reveal this, pay 1 life. If you do, you just can't drop your hand. It's just an insanely strong card because it's free, it's anti-hand discard, and most of the time, you're just going to be using it probably to charge the 2 gauge, but there are scenarios where you just don't want to take damage from a specific attack. Next, we have the brand new Sweet Happy Time. For the low cost of paying a life, you get 3 main effects. You're most likely going to end up using its second or third effect, where its second effect is during this turn, all monsters on your field can't be rested by your opponent's card effects. So that just helps you be able to attack and continue the pressure. And then its other effect is during this turn, abilities of monsters on your field can't be nullified by your opponent's card effects. This just shuts out ability nullification, which is very strong because most of the time you're going to want to nullify their abilities to get rid of Soul Guard and any other problematic effects that they might have, like it can't be destroyed, and this just helps you keep yours around, and if you're not afraid of losing your abilities, it helps it so your monsters can't even be rested. The other ability of this turn, all monsters on your opponent's field get minus 10,000 defense. That's kind of irrelevant based on the state of the game and where the game is headed. Most of the time, you're just going to basically pay 1 life to get the last 2 effects. Next, we have Buddy Option. Buddy Option is seeing less and less relevance recently, but it's still a very strong generic card where you get to choose one of the following 2. Either for this turn, give a buddy Penetrate, and plus 5,000 power, which sometimes giving your buddy penetrate, depending on what your buddy is pretty alright, but most of the time you're just going to be using the second part where you put this into the soul of a monster or item on your field. And then if this card is in the soul of a monster or item on your field, its abilities and all cards on your field can't be nullified by your opponent's card effects. It's kind of filling the role of what Sweet Happy Time is doing, except Sweet Happy Time is doing it just a tiny bit differently, to where you're just trying to make sure your abilities aren't nullified. Next, we have Around the World Athora SD. This card's pretty good because it helps interact with the opponent's souls. So there's not a whole lot of like direct soul aggression in the game currently, and this is just one of those cards that's filling that role of, hey, my opponent is playing a big soul deck, so in response I'm going to side in Athora and screw around with the fact that they're playing with a whole bunch of souls. So what this card does is when this card enters the field, choose a monster on your opponent's field. You may pay 1 gauge, discard a card from your hand. If you do, return all souls from the chosen card to the owner's hand. And then when it attacks, you gain 1 life. It's a size 0, so it fits into a lot of board states, but most of the time you just really care about screwing over your opponent's souls, so that way you can just apply the pressure and not feel like you're just hitting a dead end. Next, we have Buddy Trust. Buddy Trust is pretty interesting. It's not seeing a whole lot of play right now, but that doesn't mean it's not a bad card. Its cost is pretty efficient. For paying 1 gauge, you get to choose one of the following 2. You could either reduce the next damage you take by an opponent's monster's effect by 2, or its other ability and its primary use, for this turn, all monsters on each player's field can't be returned to hand. This is just an anti-bounce card. So a lot of the generic world cards are just a lot of basically hate cards. They just want to hate on specific strategies or specific cards in general. This is a anti-bounce card. Athora's an anti-soul card. Sweet Happy Time's anti-nullifier. Buddy Blocker's anti-nullifier. Recovery Veil's anti-discard, so on and so forth. Usually each one of these generic cards just have multiple different modes, and their primary mode is what you're going to be looking at most of the time. Next, we have Promise of Rainbow. So this is a pretty good card because it doesn't have any call cost. And then when this card is put into the drop zone from your deck by your opponent's card effects, put this card from your drop zone to your hand. This is basically the anti-mill card. And then you can choose one of the following 2. Rest a monster on your opponent's field, which is very good and very powerful. Or, for this turn, cards in your deck can't be dropped by your opponent's card effects. This just double downs and ensures that mill just is not very good. So if you're afraid if your opponent's running mill, this is anti-mill. Next, we have Kill Order. For paying 1 life, you get to choose one of the following 2. Either put the top 2 cards of your deck into your gauge, then if your opponent has 2 or more cards in their gauge, put the top 2 from your deck into your gauge. So if your opponent has more gauge past you gaining 2 gauge, you just gain an additional 2 gauge. And then its other mode is destroy a size 0 monster on your opponent's field. Most of the time, this is just a really good generic world card for just gaining a whole bunch of gauge if you know your opponent is going to be gaining a lot of gauge. This is one of those few where it's not really an anti-anything. It kind of is, because in a way it's catching you up to where your opponent is, because it's saying that your opponent is ahead on gauge and now this is your way of catching up. Next, we have Time Sale. So Time Sale is really good because it is free if you have 3 or less life. It's kind of like a weird anti-life card where once you hit a certain threshold, it just becomes free and its ability is really good. But outside of that, it's kind of expensive, but the fact that it's a generic world draw 2 is very important. So what the card does is you pay 2 gauge and pay 2 life, and then you just draw 2 and you can only activate it once per turn. So this allows every deck to have a draw 2, whether they get to 3 or less life or not. So the idea behind the card is, oh, you're behind on life, your life is low, you're almost dead. Here's a way to help dig yourself out of that hole by just giving you the ability to just not pay anything and draw 2 cards. Next, we have A Wise Move. By paying 2 gauge and paying 1 life, basically you can can counter, call a battle deity robot monster or a size 1 monster from your drop zone by paying its call cost. Most of the time, you're just going to be paying the cost to play a size 1 from your drop zone, which, depending on the deck, this is one of those more deck-specific cards because not all decks are going to be running size 1s, but depending on the deck, this could be a very effective card at just bringing back a size 1, and depending on what the deck is, getting that size 1's effect off, and that can help push you into a better position. Next, we have Field Canceller. So this is the anti-set spell card, where you pay 2 gauge, discard a card from your hand, and destroy all spells on the field. Yes, it destroys yours, but most of the time, you care about destroying your opponents. So ideally, the situation is you play Field Canceller, get rid of all of their set spells, and then you play your set spells. So that way, it's kind of like a one-sided board wipe, but it really isn't, but it kind of is. Next, we have Chest Break. Chest Break, you get to choose one of the following 2. Note it doesn't have a cast cost. You can either put 2 spells from your opponent's field to the bottom of the deck in any order, or counter for this turn, a monster on your opponent's field gets minus 2,000 power and minus 1 crit. This is again another set spell hate card where it just is specifically targeting set spells. Like, it's not saying set spells, but it's specifically targeting set spells. And then it has a defensive option, which isn't very good, but its primary function is just set spell hate. Next, we have Guru Bunbuku. This card isn't really seeing a whole lot of play, but it's a very effective card for a lot of aggressive decks. What this card does is counter, choose a monster on your field. You may discard a card from your hand, pay 1 gauge. If you do, the chosen card gets plus 3,000 power, plus 3,000 defense, plus 1 crit, move, and penetrate. This is just a really solid card at just trying to help push the aggression even further, and the fact that it's in generic world and most of the time you really care about the crit and penetrate, it just means it could help any deck be very aggressive. Next, we have Barbed Wire. Barbed Wire is just rest an item on your opponent's field. So this is kind of like item hate, where a lot of items now, they'll have abilities and a whole bunch of different ways to attack or utilize items. This is just a really good way at just saying, you know what, I don't feel like getting attacked by your item, let's just rest it down. Because items themselves don't have a lot of built-in protection, so if an item has double or triple attack or has a whole lot of crit, this can just rest it. It saves you a lot of damage. Next, we have Gambit. Gambit's pretty interesting because this is one of the cards that has more of a niche use. All it does is return all monsters from your field to your hand, and then you can only cast it once per turn. Ideally, what this card does is it allows you to reset your board and basically get a lot of the triggers of when monsters are called. If they don't have a restriction to their ability, which a good portion of the time they don't, this just allows you to basically just reuse all of the cards that you've played for another effect. Next, we have Damage Control. Damage Control is a generic set spell that just helps mitigate damage. Counter, during your opponent's turn, you can discard a card from your hand. If you do, the next time you take damage, it's reduced by 2. If you discarded a Battle Deity Robot card, the next damage you take is reduced by 4 instead. What this does and why it's decent as a generic card is, 1, it's a discard outlet. So if you really need to discard cards from your hand, this is a good way to discard them in any world. So most of the time, certain worlds will have specific cards where you just discard to do something. This is just the generic version of whatever those would be. So I know Legend World has a lot of cards where it's like discard this, rest something down, discard this, you get to search for something, and then they have a whole bunch of on discard effects. But sometimes you want to like just have a card in your drop zone just so you could use another card in your hand. So this just gets it out while reducing damage on the field. Next, we have one of the new cards that's going to be coming out. Preservation of Prosperity and Vanity, Re-Arc Empress. What this card does is it shuts off deck searching. So if your opponent is running a deck where they have a whole bunch of different ways to search cards and just different searchers in general, this helps shut that down. Counteract, you can drop this card from your hand. If you do, the next time your opponent would look at their whole deck, your opponent only looks at the top 4 instead. It's just really good at shutting down search cards by limiting what they can search for. Then we have one of the other new cards, Buddy Fighters Without Limits. It's not really a generic card, but for all intents and purposes, it says you can use this with all flags. So for the most part, it is a generic card, but it really isn't. What this card does is when this card is dropped from your hand by an ability of your opponent's card effects, you draw 2, and for this turn, your hand can't be dropped by opponent's card effects. Like Recovery Veil, this is just another anti-discard card where it really doesn't like it when your opponent is trying to make you discard. And then it has 2 abilities of its own. Counter, choose one of the following. You either gain 3 life or give a monster on your opponent's turn -2 crit. Its defensive options are pretty okay. Gaining 3 life at counter speed can be relevant. So can minusing 2 the opponent's crit. So if their opponent can attack a whole bunch of times with 1 monster, just minusing 2 crit just helps mitigate a lot of potential damage. So those are all of the decent generic world cards. Generic world staples are just designed to just be hate cards. I'm not necessarily a huge fan with just straight up printing silver bullets like these, but sometimes the game is headed into a direction where it's almost needed more often than not. But just as a general good to know, these are just the good generic world cards. I'm planning on going over the staples for all of the other worlds, but I just figured I would want to start with generic world because people are always asking, hey, I'm new to the game, how do I sideboard? What are some good cards to invest in? What are some good cards to pick up? And usually my reply is always invest in the generic world staples. And then after that would be invest in whatever specific world you're playing's staples. But a lot of people don't know what those are, so I wanted to create something to help inform a lot of players what those cards are. So I hope you enjoyed this kind of content. Don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel, and I'll have the list of all of these cards in the description below in case you're curious and want to look these up yourself. Some of them might not be out yet, like the last 2, but for the most part, a lot of them are. Feel free to look at them at your leisure, and I'll see you in the next video.